The United States and Iran have been arch enemies for decades now, and once again, tensions are running high. The question is, can the incoming Biden administration and the divided leadership in Tehran renegotiate the nuclear agreement that Donald Trump walked away from in 2018? And at what price? Certainly a lot hinges on what the two sides choose to do next. So here on To The Point, we ask, Iran and America, is a new nuclear deal possible? Well, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on To The Point, where my guests are Soraya Sarhaddi Nelson, a US-Iranian journalist based here in Berlin, who says any new Iran nuclear deal that the Biden administration negotiates will require concessions to Tehran that will hurt the president at home. Also with us is Cornelius Adebahr from the German Council on Foreign Relations. His opinion, the Europeans need to seize the moment to reinvigorate diplomacy, first on the nuclear file, then on regional security. And a very warm welcome too to Daniel Gerlach, editor-in-chief of the Middle East quarterly Zenith, who argues that the Middle East needs a new framework for security and cooperation. Without this, there will be no stability. Thank you all three for those statements. A good start to the show, and I'd like to go straight to Soraya with the inevitable question: how tense is the relationship between Iran and the US right now?
Well, it's pretty bad. I mean, it's been many years since it's been this bad, although I would argue it's a little better than it was on January 19th, before the new president came in, because it's very clear that President Joe Biden would like to see that changed. He really wants to go back to some sort of conversation with Iran.
And Daniel Gerlach, let's just get technical for a moment, because last week the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency was in Tehran just a week ago. That was a very important visit. Just explain why.
Well, it's important because Iran has threatened, well, let's say the Iranian parliament has also asked for Iran to suspend the control of this International Atomic Agency. And this is, of course, a violation not only of the Iran nuclear deal, but also of other non-proliferation agreements that Iran has subscribed to. And so these negotiations were an important signal. They were also an important signal because there is some sort of international arrangement, of international mechanism still alive. Of course, the Iranians know that Europe is nervous. They know that the Americans are nervous. They know that everyone in the region is nervous. And they themselves have the problem that the Iranian government doesn't want to give in to the pressure of certain hardline factions in the parliament that dominate the parliament. And so they somehow want to show that they're still in control, they're still in charge, and they're still willing to negotiate.
So, Cornelius, everybody's talking about the prospect of a renewed nuclear deal. Is it going to happen, and who needs it most?
Well, the world needs it. It's been a remarkable achievement to have this kind of an agreement back in 2015 to set standards for nuclear verification for what a country can do legitimately under the international conventions. And so it would be bad if it were simply left to fade out, as it were, after the departure of the United States and then the subsequent non-compliance with the Iranians. But the window that has been opened by this recent visit in Tehran, the window of opportunity is short. We are speaking about 3-4 months max, where we need to have some kind of an accord to reinstate the old agreement and then go on to some follow-on negotiations. So this is really an issue of urgency.
And when Cornelius talks about the old deal, what he's talking about is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was signed, as we've seen, back in 2015. Back then, Barack Obama was the US president, and he called the deal a victory for diplomacy.
After years of tense negotiations, the US, the UK, France, Russia, China and Germany signed the nuclear agreement with Iran in 2015 in Vienna. In the treaty, Iran promised to refrain from any activity that could serve the production of nuclear weapons and agreed to have that checked. In return, economic sanctions against the country would be lifted. Then in 2018, relations broke down. Barack Obama's successor Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. from the agreement. Harsh sanctions against the Islamic Republic followed. The result, Iran no longer feels bound to the deal and is ramping up uranium enrichment significantly. Now the international inspectors' monitoring of the nuclear facilities is set to be limited. Iran says it won't return to its obligations under the agreement until the sanctions are lifted. The deal could be revived by the new U.S. administration under Joe Biden, but it wants to renegotiate the deal, something Iran opposes. How could such a new agreement come about?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I suppose you could also say, one German newspaper that I saw, they had the headline, "Is this the end of the road for the nuclear deal?" Do you share that pessimism, Daniel?
No, I don't share it. I think the deal was reasonable and the deal can be implemented. It has proven successful to a certain extent, so I don't see any reason why one wouldn't be able to return to this deal. The question is just like, is everyone willing to do so? And the other question is, don't we create some false expectations when we think that we could probably include other issues of regional security?
This is the problem. This is the point that Joe Biden has been making. So,
well, he hasn't. I think he has been a bit willfully ambiguous about it. He hasn't said that he wants to include, for example, the Iranian missile program into this deal, and I think he knows very well why he didn't do so. His team of advisors are seasoned diplomats, people with experience in negotiations, and people with experience in Iran negotiations.
The establishment is back.
To a certain extent, yes, of course, and they're being harshly criticized by the Republican camp. But in general, I think they know very well what the Iranians are up to. And they know that the Iranians would not, that this is the kind of a red line to include any other regional security issues into the nuclear deal. And to be honest, they will be vindicated because even the Europeans, America's closest allies, always said, this deal is about limiting or disenabling the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and it's not there to sort out or to create regional security arrangements. That should be done I think, in a different round of negotiations, in a different format, in which the US should definitely not take the lead.
The diplomats talk about the choreography of all this, how we get from A to B to C, wherever it is we're going to be going, wherever it is we want to be. Tell us a little bit more about that process.
Well, that's something which cannot simply be done by the United States and Iran alone, because both countries have domestic politics on this going on, and there is pressure in the United States from the Republican camp, but also from hardliners within the Democratic camp.
Hardliners on both sides, mirroring each other in many ways.
That's an interesting observation. And the same is true for Iran. I mean, one tends to take Iran as a unitary country, you know, the mullahs on top ruling everything. But behind this scene of this facade, there is real power play going on between various camps also inside Iran. And as Daniel Gerlach was saying, the parliament has put out a demand that the investors be kicked out, and the government has to somehow comply with it. And there was this arrangement being done with the International Atomic Energy Agency. But what has to happen now is that a mediator like the European Union would have to lay out over the next, say, 2-3 months, what does each side need to do in order to go back into compliance, so that at a point in the future, before probably June, both sides can claim, at this particular moment in time, we have both come into compliance, because they have drawn their red lines on this.
That sounds like synchronicity. That would be seventh heaven for the diplomats, but that's not quite the way things are at the moment. I mean, it's all a big discussion about who's going to make the first step, who's going to make the first concession.
Well, I think in terms of who has the ability to do that, I do think that rests with the Americans. In the end, it was the Americans that pulled out first and sort of started this cascade. And secondly, Iran, or the Iranian government currently, is battling to stay in power. That would be the more moderate, well, whatever that means nowadays, faction that's in charge there. And they have elections coming up in June, and there's a lot of pressure behind the scenes.
What's going to happen in the elections that's going to have an impact on the story we're trying to sort of tell or understand here?
Well, there are a lot of conservative leaders who are sort of populist, if you will, where there is some appeal to them, even though they are not exactly what perhaps the younger generation is looking for in terms of having more freedoms, that sort of thing. But they are sort of speaking to people's struggles, very real struggles in Iran right now. I mean, these sanctions and the sanctions before them and the sanctions before those have really decimated the Iranian economy. I mean, there are a lot of very educated young people who can't get jobs and they're unable to leave, although now, obviously, the pressure has been lifted a little bit on people getting visas to get out of Iran, but it's a real struggle. And Rouhani has been a disappointment. You know, he has a lot of the problems that a incumbent candidate in Iran does, because there are some very real problems there, as mentioned. So I do think that in the case of Joe Biden, if he were able to somehow finagle something that brings both parties to the table simultaneously, that might help jumpstart it. But I agree.
Yes,
I was going to say, I agree, though, that it can't be a multitude of topics. It really needs to focus on getting the deal going again or back on first, and then we can worry about all the other stuff in different arrangements.
If you allow me to jump in here, because why is it significant, the presidential election? You have the narrative on the one hand that the supreme leader of Iran is not up for election. He's going to stay. So he's the one who takes the final decision on everything. And of course, in the United States, I often hear the argument, it doesn't matter who is the president, because the supreme leader, eventually, he's the establishment of the Islamic Republic. He is the regime, and therefore, he's the one who's going to take the decision. That's not very much, like in my view, not the case, because the one who has to roll out the politics and the policy is the president. Of course, the supreme leader has a final decision, and the National Security Council does. But the president has to establish a cabinet. He has to assemble a team to continue negotiations and to design the foreign policy. So the role of the president is extremely important. I don't share the view that it's all a game of hardliners and conservatives in Iran. For example, Rouhani has been branded the rationalist camp. But he's the one who cares about national security. He might be a rationalist, a reformist person in certain aspects, but after all, he is the guy for national security. He has a background in intelligence and national security and defense, and that's his logic, that's what he cares about. And I think there is, to a certain extent, a consensus in Iran regarding certain issues of national and regional security, which is not, regardless of if you are conservative or if you are hardline or reformist. And therefore, Rouhani was elected, and though he might have been a disappointment in terms of economic reform and liberal reform, I think he delivered on the national security issue.
I think that's one more reason to be, forceful in pressing for diplomacy now, because with this election, there will certainly be also a change of policy inside Iran. Obviously, history doesn't repeat itself, and if so, it does from tragedy to farce. But if you look at the Iranian negotiations and compare it to what happened between 2003 and 2005, the Europeans had started these negotiations, the nuclear negotiations. Rouhani was their counterpart. And then a new president was elected, Ahmadinejad, many of us will remember as a firebrand and as a difficult negotiation partner. So what may happen just now, again, is that we are still in this phase where dialogue is possible, where the Iranian government has said that they want the nuclear deal to be reactivated. But if we wait until after the election with a new president, and the irony is that President Ahmadinejad, former president, may run again. He's mulling. He's making noises.
And then you'd have Trump on the other side, basically.
Oh, there we go.
Or Mike Pompeo for the next presidential elections. So.
And then we're really down the drain.
OK, one word that I haven't heard, I think that I haven't heard from any of you so far in the discussion, and that surprises me, is trust. Yeah?
Why does that surprise you?
The drastic absence of trust between the two sides. How do you overcome that?
Well, again, I think the ball is in the American court to try and make an overture that suggests that not only will they come back to the table in a way that is respectful of Iran, not just telling it what to do and carrying out hawkish policies, but also that shows some sort of lasting effect, because there is a great fear. What happens after 4 years? 2024 is around the corner, and it's not just the nuclear deal that, where new provisions have to be drawn, but it's also, potentially another Republican president, and not just any Republican president. It could be Donald Trump Mike Pompeo, was that what you suggested? Anything's possible, I guess, but... yeah.
Go on.
There's also been a lack of trust on the side in the Iranians, I would like to say. I mean, the Europeans who shepherded this deal in 2015, they really thought that once the deal is in place, one can tackle these other issues, regional security issues. But Iran had none of that. They were expanding in the region, obliging by the nuclear deal, but doing anything else that was in their own interest, regional-wise. And so the Europeans are disappointed with the Iranians. Vice versa, the Iranians would have hoped that the Europeans had much more of a backbone when it came to US sanctions. So we didn't mention trust because it's not there, I would simply say. And that's why it's also important to salvage the deal as much as it's there, to build from that basis again.
Ironically, I disagree here. I don't think it's a lack of trust. I think that trust is being overestimated in this whole game, and for the following reason. If you look at the Iranian diplomatic and governmental establishment, like foremost, of course, Foreign Minister Zarif, you see the way that he commands diplomacy. A mix of being sometimes a bit bullish, sometimes being rather like playing the seducing card. So they command like all colors of diplomacy that like in a very old-fashioned style. But they always think that the West knows our true intentions, which is, why would we use a nuclear weapon against our neighbors? We're just doing this to defend ourselves because we are being attacked. They know that much of what we say is to create bargain chips and rhetoric, and they underestimate the true fear and the way the misreading of the supposedly true intentions of Iran on the Western side. The Iranians, and this is quite interesting because many of the Iranian leaders have studied in the West, they know Western society very well, but they underestimate to what extent the regional neighbors, the Israelis, even some Europeans and Americans are truly afraid of the Iranian intentions.
Exactly.
And that is
Israel is not going to let
is...
anybody underestimate the level of fear that is felt in Israel. That's Benjamin Netanyahu's mantra.
Of course, we have people in the Israeli security establishment who know very well, who are asking for a swift return to the nuclear deal, and they've been advocates of the deal before. The climate between Washington and Jerusalem or Tel Aviv is at the moment not the best, because the U.S. government very well remembers like the very disloyal demeanor of Benjamin Netanyahu in the last years or the last days of the Obama-Biden administration. So they're not on very good terms at the moment, but at the same time they're pragmatic and reasonable, and they know that Israel, on the one hand, could benefit from a nuclear deal, but of course it wouldn't solve any of the regional issues that Israel is involved in and exposed to.
Okay. Well, Iran certainly seems to be facing more uncertainty, but one thing is for sure, the sanctions and the COVID crisis are together having a devastating impact on the people of Iran.
Ever since the US placed sanctions on Iran, its economy has shrunk at least 5% every year. Oil production, the country's most important source of revenue, has almost completely stalled, as has its banking sector. Many European companies have also been pulling back for fear of reprisals from the US. The result, prices have been skyrocketing, and Iran's inflation rate is currently around 30%. Those suffering most are the Iranian people. Many hope a resumption of negotiations with the West will help bring improvements. People have been living under severe economic pressure, and if they want to cut off cooperation, that pressure will of course intensify. The problems have become so huge that people can't even live a normal life. But the government first wants to get rid of the sanctions.
The problem is, US is addicted to sanctions. US is addicted to pressure. US is addicted to bullying.
Are sanctions the best bargaining chip?
The US is addicted to bullying.
It's hard to argue with that. That's certainly how it comes across, and it has for 4 years very loudly, to the point where there have been actions taken. You know, the assassination of Soleimani, and you know, these sorts of things do not play well in Iran. And I think again it plays into the hands of the more hardline factions, which are.
It is very extreme. It is very extreme language, but it's a language that is used to speak to the people on the ground.
Yes.
Whose lives now, a normal life, is no longer possible. That's what we heard in that report. Is that your view of the situation? Is that how dire it has become?
Well, certainly, I still have some relatives who live there, and it definitely is very difficult. Made more difficult by the fact that people weren't able to travel for those who could travel, you know, for a long time. So, and with COVID and everything, But the Iranians have also, I think this is something that's been going on for them in terms of not being able to function normally, you know, having to deal with sanctions, not having things available to them. That's been going on for more than a generation at this point because sanctions are nothing new. And it's, again, I feel that it is something that has made the regime last as long as it did. It's never really had to answer for the problems that exist, the very real problems that exist in Iran for people, whether it's unemployment, you know, inflation, just growing poverty, growing education at the same time, which is always very interesting that it's one of the most educated populations that you'll find, certainly in the Middle East or, you know, anywhere. But it's something that needs to be addressed, and it would do the U.S. Administration well, I think, to try and present a little bit of a different image. But it's a problem for Joe Biden at home because that is how the majority of Americans, and including in the Democratic Party, think they should be dealing with.
Cornelius, what can you tell us about the lives of ordinary people caught in the middle of this conflict?
Well, it's been as dire as the clip has just shown. And it is also something where the Iranian population, for better or for worse, has gotten used to. The pandemic is coming on top. But it's nothing that they should be exposed to, if only because for a long time at least, Iran was complying with the nuclear deal. The pullout of the United States out of the nuclear deal, the reimposition of sanctions, was not justified by any policy moves, if you like, except for a change of heart on the side of the U.S. government, with the chain of government, obviously. But the problem with sanctions is that they tend to be overestimated in what they can achieve. If you look at the evidence of decades of economic sanctions, they rarely work. They are used as a policy instrument to placate voters, to show strength, to try to follow a narrative of putting someone down to their knees. But when has this happened? Ironically, the JCPOA, with this concerted push, is maybe the one exception where people realized, okay, it can work if we combine it with diplomacy. And that's what was missing over the past 4 years of the previous administration, any serious attempt to engage Iran or the activities of Iran at the diplomatic level. So I'd be cautious as to what the prospects of even more pressure can achieve.
Daniel, you're itching to get in.
Well, sanctions are probably not directed against Iran, but are a tool to discipline everybody else. Of course, they have some sort of impact on Iran, but of course they have a stronger impact on the region, and they have a strong impact also on the relationship between America and Europe. I think you're right, Cornelius. Sanctions are being overestimated, but lifting sanctions is also being overestimated in terms of an economic benefit. The Iranian regime or the Iranian government, for that matter, has been promising, of course, to the Iranian population that the nuclear deal is going to bring foreign investment, it's going to bring a prosperous economic development. That wasn't the case for a number of reasons. Not only because Iranian economy cannot just be healed by foreign investment, but also by the fact that the companies that could invest in Iran, that could normalize the relationship with Iran, are still scared to death because they think even if they don't violate any law, they might be at a later stage sanctioned affected by secondary sanctions by the United States because the US control the financial sector, banks. And so I think even if we return to a nuclear deal, we shouldn't create false expectations in Iran. The Iranian economy is not going to prosper because of that. Because if you are a middle-sized entrepreneur in Europe, and you know that maybe in 4 years, Trump, Pompeo, much more hardline than Trump, much more uncompromising in terms of Iran, might return to power, you think twice before you launch a major investment in Iran. And so therefore the Iranian government should not promise the Iranian population that this is all about the economy. The nuclear deal is a matter of international security, but the economic prosperity doesn't depend on this alone.
Soraya, with your Persian-Iranian roots, can you, at the end of the show here, we don't have much time, can you give us a positive take on the future for Iran and Iranians in the medium term?
Well, I think the dialogue is, or the type of language that's been used on the Iranian part and in the American part will change. I think it'll be softer, and I think that's going to present some hope. I agree that lifting the sanctions is not going to be a miracle cure, but it's also something that's going to hold the regime feet to the fire. They're going to have to answer for why aren't things getting better after they promised it, and that's a tool that works for the United States as well. So I think things are somewhat positive, but I'm not optimistic that the deal will be struck.
The very last word, is there going to be a nuclear deal between the two sides in the coming months?
Well, the deal is still there. We just have 3-4 months to agree that we still want it to be alive. I'm fairly optimistic that we will get there.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed. Great debate here on To The Point. If you've enjoyed it as much as I have, do come back next time round. Until then, bye-bye and cheers.